minutes, and then we're going to have Q&A session. Thank you.
Thanks, Yuri, for that nice introduction. And thank you so much for this. Can everybody hear me? A little louder, please. Okay, I'll do my best. Thanks for inviting me to be here. I'm really happy to be able to speak to all of you who are obviously very interested in Ukraine issues, as am I. Obviously, I spent the majority of my career and professional life thinking about various issues of identity, particularly nationalism when it concerns Ukraine. But today I thought I would talk to you about this idea of Ukraine's Soviet inheritance and its Soviet baggage. And what I really want to convey is that the idea that national identity matters is very important. And it's very important not just from an ideological perspective or a very abstract cultural perspective, but from an actual real policy perspective. And at some point, every nation in its own history has to deal with the national question. You have to ask yourselves the question, what does it mean to be French, German, or Italian, or American, or in this case, Ukrainian? And I think this question is particularly salient right now in Ukraine in the context of the current crisis, in the context of the current war. And I think that Ukraine is at a turning point in its history. I don't think anybody would disagree with that. But I think it's a turning point in its history in terms of it could either develop into a coherent sort of sense of belonging, a collective sense of belonging, or it could become progressively more polarizing due to Russian aggression. So these are the themes I'll be talking to you a bit about today. So what do I mean when I talk about Soviet baggage? Well, I'm talking about legacies that Ukraine inherited that had really no control over. And the three things that I'm going to highlight is this idea of Ukraine being an accidental state. These are sort of concepts we hear in the popular discourse. This notion of there being not one but two Ukraines, which was very popular during the Russian invasion, of course. And also this inheritance of a broken citizen-state relationship. And once I cover those very briefly, and I hope that Valeria, when she arrives, she'll be speaking a bit more about the idea of national identity and nationalism in the post-Maidan period. So I'll introduce those concepts just very quickly, and then I'll switch to talking about what does this all mean for real policy implications. So what is this idea of the accidental state? Well, 23 years ago, right about now actually, Ukrainians voted for the independence of Ukraine from the Soviet Union. And that vote was supported by 92% of Ukrainians at the time. But at the same time, this vote was the result of externally imposed factors. There was an attempted coup, some of you are old enough to remember, against Yeltsin on August 19th, 1991, which forced the eventual dissolution of the Soviet Union. And for this reason, people have called Ukraine an accidental state. It became independent without a long-term struggle that we saw, for example, in Poland with the Solidarity movement. There was no revolutionary war. It was a peaceful transition. It was a political transition. And Ukraine in the early 90s did not experience what we could call a color revolution either. That came much later. And the other reason that we've heard Ukraine being referred to as an accidental state is the shifting borders of the Ukrainian, what was the Ukrainian Socialist Soviet Republic. So prior to the annexation of Crimea, Ukraine retained its political borders in 1954 when Crimea was added to the Soviet Socialist Republic of Ukraine. And prior to that Soviet period, the Western regions were alternately split between the Austro-Hungarian and Polish empires, while the Eastern regions were part of the Russian Empire. And then in the Soviet period, Soviet policies of uneven development reinforced this division between the industrial East and the more agricultural West and Center, and continued mass disinvestment in the agricultural sector in the Soviet period, combined with forced collectivization, effectively undermined economic development in most of the country. And The other thing we hear often, especially in this context of post-Maidan, is that Ukraine is not just one country, but it's two Ukraines, right? And this has led to commentators talking about this idea of Ukraine being divided. And I'm sure this is something you've seen before as people who are interested in Ukraine, right? There's this idea that there's political differences in voting patterns that overlap with ethnic and linguistic differences. So whereas in the West, in the center, Ukrainians tend to support more national democratic candidates, like Yulia Tymoshenko or Yushchenko in the Orange Revolution, in the East, they tended to support communist or the Party of Regions types of leaders. But this linguistic breakdown that we've seen a lot in the media and its correspondence to voting patterns is also misleading. Because if we look at the ethnic breakdown specifically, Ukraine is a lot more homogeneous than many modern nation states. There are Ukrainians in the West and Russians in the East, this is true. But these differences are not as pronounced as the media may lead you to believe, and of course as the Russian state media has led us to believe. In other words, what we see from this chart, and this is ethnicity, and the source is the 2001 Ukrainian census, is that there are many Russian-speaking ethnic Ukrainian, and that most Ukrainians are actually bilingual. And in general, if we think about Ukraine as an accidental or divided state, it's a terminology that's been used for this country, but in fact, every single country has had a moment of contingency in its national state formation. If we think about Germany or France in the 19th centuries, these were not coherent nation states with a linguistic and ethnic, homogeneous, monolingual, monocultural, political divisions, right? The countries were divided and there was a period of state building and nation building that took place. So in some ways, what's happened in Ukraine, what's happening in Ukraine now is nation building and state building at an extremely accelerated rate. Something that took centuries in Western European countries is happening very quickly in Ukraine. So in many ways, this idea of an accidental state or the divided Ukraine is something that's been inherited from the Soviet period, I would argue. And it has more to do with the Soviet state and the vision of nationhood, or the lack thereof, that the country inherited. So, and the last piece that I see as Soviet baggage is this broken state-citizen relationship that I mentioned earlier. And by that I mean is that there's a deep distrust in the state and state institutions and government leaders that still remains in Ukraine in the post-Soviet period. So these are just a few statistics that I recently looked up, but they're quite telling. Between 2005 and 2013, a maximum of 10% of Ukrainians said they trusted the government to do what's right. Less than 20% said they have confidence in national government. This is the most recent Gallup poll. And in terms of the corruption index, we can't really blame Ukrainians for not trusting their government when it is one of the lowest ranking countries. So 142, 175 is the most corrupt. And so 142 is very low. And this is according to Transparency International. So very low in the ranking, very high in terms of corruption. And it's particularly, I think, shocking that Russia's TI ranking is 136, which means it's less corrupt in Ukraine than Ukraine. I mean, this is all based on people's perception of their own governments, of course. And just to give you an overview of distrust in state and government institutions versus personal trust of personal networks, I just recently saw this and stole this from another article from Ilona Sologub's article, who used statistics from the Kyiv Institute of Sociology. And this tracks the balance of trust, which means it's the difference between people who said they fully trust or mostly trust the government versus those who don't or mostly don't. And so the lines to pay attention to here is the government lines, right? So the purple line of the cabinet of ministers, right? And then the blue line, which is the president. And what we see is that over time, this was tracking from 1994 until 2013, we see peaks, particularly around the Orange Revolution, and obviously right prior to Yanukovych's ouster. There were high peaks in distrust. But peer-to-peer trust has remained more or less stable, more or less, over time. So how can this broken citizen-state relationship be overcome? Well, now that Valeria is here, I hope she'll speak to this a bit more. But I would propose that the way to overcome this leftover Soviet baggage is with a vision of nationalism that is not about extremism, which is what we often heard in the news media, right? That is not about an ethnic vision of Ukraine, but a vision of nationalism and national identity as the term that I borrow is from Benedict Anderson, this idea of an imagined community, which of course can be inclusive or exclusive. But this includes sort of this idea there's national narratives that are based on common struggles, founding myths, and heroes that can arise. And I would say that the Maidan Revolution was much more about the second vision of nationalism than about the first, the more inclusive vision of this imagined community. And interestingly, as a side note, because most of my other work is on far-right parties, it's been interesting to observe in Ukraine that since Maidan, the far right has lost a mass of its support. And it hasn't resurged, right? This was a big fear back in the fall of 2013. And this hasn't happened, which I think speaks a lot to the message of what Maidan was really about. It was about a democratic mass movement. Then the question, of course, is how does something like the national identity even emerge? Well, I mean, this is just to remind you what Maidan looked like in 2013 at its peak. I think this is a very powerful image that is now often forgotten as we're talking about, military tactics, various, whereas they're counting casualties. But Maidan was really a massive movement by Ukrainian people. And we know from social movement studies that participation in protest movements is a galvanizing and very important aspect of the formation of identity, right? And I can tell you from just anecdotal evidence, and maybe some of you were there when this was happening as well, that people who participated in Maidan, who were there on the streets, who were there in the protests, developed a very different sense of what it means to be Ukrainian. Because once you stand somewhere and you put your life at risk for a vision, you have to ask yourself why you're doing that. And I think the challenge now for Ukraine is to see if there can be an inclusive vision that will fill this void of what it means to be Ukrainian. And one of those things is, will there be an emergence of national heroes that can be inclusive versus exclusive, right? Stepan Bandera, to some, he's a freedom fighter, a hero, right? To others, he was a murderer and a neo-Nazi collaborator. He's a polarizing figure, whatever you may think of him, right? I'm assuming all of you know who that is at this point. And can these polarizing heroes be replaced with inclusive heroes? For example, like those that died in the Maidan, the Heavenly 100. I took that picture last time, all the stuff in the Maidan was still there. So, and we've seen some elements of this. We've seen the transformation, but were previously very polarizing images and symbols and slogans be transformed into mainstream inclusive symbols and slogans. One example is, of course, the call "Glory to Ukraine, glory to the heroes," Slava Ukraini, Geroyam Slava, which has become a very mainstream thing to say. And it used to be. It used to be polarizing. So I talked a lot about, what are the challenges of overcoming the Soviet legacy, and I defined what national identity is a bit. But then the question is, what does this mean for policy? Like, why does this matter? Why do we care if people think of themselves Ukrainian or they don't? I think these three inheritances from the Soviet period, the accidental state, this uneven development between the urban and the rural, between the central west and the east, and these broken citizen-state relationships have mass consequences for the current reform process at every single level. Because if people don't see themselves contributing to a collective public good, then how can we convince them to pay taxes, right? So when it comes to the anti-corruption reforms, that are moving in progress right now, right? There's been the establishment of an anti-corruption bureau and an anti-corruption agency. These organizations, these institutions are empowered to prosecute. But the question is, will we see these types of legal actions that will make people believe that their government is working for them and not for itself? In terms of budget, there needs to be allocation transparency. I recently heard the new Minister of Finance speak on these issues, Natalie Oresko, who many of you may know, is an American-born, American-educated new Minister of Finance in Ukraine. And she was saying that the basic problem between the current budget is that there's very little transparency. Well, she wouldn't use those terms in my terms. There's transparency between how budget is allocated from the national to the regional level, but then between the regional and the local there's no formula for this. So the regional governments are pretty much left to decide for themselves how they'll distribute various budgets to the municipalities, which of course introduces potential problems, right? Potential corruption practices. On the other hand, when it comes to court reform, no immunity for judges, this is also something that individuals have to demand. And I already mentioned the tax code. You know, right now corporate tax reform is going through Ukraine, but the problem is that nobody really knows what the tax code is. And bringing in the shadow economy, which has been functioning in Ukraine until this point, where people get paid cash under the table, so they have to avoid taxes, has to be a very important, and it is a very important part of the current reform process. And so I would just posit to you that all of these issues are solvable and manageable, but on the other hand, the key starts at the bottom. It doesn't start from the top, it starts from people's ideas about where they belong, who they are, and how they see themselves in relation to the state, in relation to their leaders, and in relation to each other. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Alina. The next speaker is going to be Valeria Korablyova. She is a professor at the Taras Shevchenko University in Kyiv, and now she is visiting Stanford. And you know, she has a long list of achievements. I'm not going to list everything, but you know, one important thing I want to mention about her was that she actually participated in the Maidan, and so she was in the streets there, and so she has a first-hand experience of how this was happening, what kind of people were there, and I hope she will share with us exactly what has happened in Maidan. Okay, which one? See the shortest.
Good evening, thanks for coming and thanks for the invitation. Thanks to the organizers. Sorry, Alina, for jumping into the middle of your presentation, but the way from Stanford to Berkeley seems to be very hard to take, you know. Nevertheless, here I am, and my presentation is titled Maidan 2 Recap. What I mean here is not to give you some set of details, some revelation about the nature lessons of Maidan, but rather why it is important to talk about it right now, because it seems that it happened like a year ago, and now we are facing some much more important challenges and threats, so maybe we should talk about something else, and Maidan has to be the issue for historians or something like that. I'm stating the opposite. My main claim is that it is crucial to focus on Maidan itself, because we usually tend to think of Maidan just as a trigger to subsequent events, which led to the change of authorities in Ukraine, to the occupation of Crimea, and to the warfare in Donbass. And we're usually focusing on the latter. But my point is here that Maidan was a cause, a genuine cause of what happened next, and that we can change this, shift the center of gravity towards Maidan itself, which allows us to reinterpret all that happened later as a consequence of Maidan. And here comes the current situation that Ukraine now is at war with Russia, although not an announced one. And it is used, well, many notions are used to determine, to define this special war, but I prefer to choose now hybrid war because it implies that it contains two different dimensions: military actions and media war. And it seems that this information dimension of this war, these counteractions, is very important, and right now Ukraine unfortunately is losing this war. That's why it's very important to think of the frameworks we usually use even to pose questions. So what I suggest you today is to reframe, to rearrange our paradigm of dealing with Maidan. My hypothesis here is that Putin wasn't able to suppress Maidan, and he yet was very successful in overcoming its consequences and by setting the framework of its interpretation. We are living in the world where, to use the words of Pierre Bourdieu, names and words are ultimate stakes in a political struggle, in a struggle for imposing the legitimate principle of dividing and vision the reality. So it is important. It is not something secondary. We live in a world we believe in, because certainly not many people actually took part in Maidan events, but much more people are observing it as an event on a screen, and so they tend to comprehend what they are being shown. And here, why is it important? Here I see the gap between the authorities in the Western world and the public. Because certainly political leaders have much more information than the average public, and they have some grounds to make some decisions. What's going on right now, and constantly has been going on for a long time. But here I name it the loop of democracy, when average public usually perceives it from Russia Today, which is very influential right now. And at the end of the day, authorities have to take into account what public opinion is. And that's why here I use the hypothesis of Timothy Snyder that Putin is very good at playing on the weak points of his opponents. So he knows the advantages and disadvantages of democracy, how it actually works, and what he can do to find these weak points and to use it as an internal weapon into the body of the opponent. Why was it a threat? I'm not sure what audience right now I'm dealing with, so maybe, sorry for repeating maybe something banal, but nevertheless. Certainly Maidan was a threat to its Tsar model, which was dominant on the post-Soviet space. And here you see a picture from Moscow, which said that yesterday it was Kiev, tomorrow is going to be Moscow. So it was kind of obvious when you are inspired of your victory, a very unexpected victory, certainly for Maidanists themselves, then you think that this is a very good case to explore it again and again and to implement it in some other countries. So it was a shift for Ukraine itself from this kind of patriarchal political culture. This is one of my favorite pictures. This is from a president of Ukraine, Yanukovych, and one his very loyal fan. So we are moving from this leaderism, and we are oriented only on the persons of whoever governs us is good, and we should obey, and that's it. End of story. This kind of patriarchal political culture towards the participatory political culture, which is much more developed in the Western world. And I think that this picture is very talkative in itself, and it's a good illustration to Maidan events. Now, so how Putin decided to deal with Maidan issue? By saying Putin, I'm not, I'm not discussing the person of the Russian leader, and especially not the state of his psychiatric state or whatever is right now is an issue to speculate on. I would not, but it's like a collective noun, a signifier for authorities, for decision makers in Russia. So we have two different frameworks. First one was used by Ukrainians. It was Revolution of Dignity. This was the main label for Maidanian events. And it's very talkative again because it says what was it all about. But on the contrary, I found out that here in the US and in Europe it's not very widespread, because on the contrary it is usually called Ukrainian crisis. And it seems that it's neutral. We are just using a disseminated word which is very actively involved in media and blah blah blah. But by saying Ukrainian crisis, we accept a bunch of connotations, that it has to do with Ukraine, that it is a crisis, certainly some negative connotations, and all the rest. And here I suggest several issues which I used to kind of to diminish Maidan, to discredit it, to devalorize, or whatever verb you prefer to choose here, if you are following my argumentation certainly. So first one, no revolution of dignity. We just do not use this word, because it was not about values. People do not share some true beliefs and no sincere goals. Herewith, we are denying their agency, so it's someone's project, Americans' project. So these are people who are kind of actors who were paid for doing what they were doing. Besides, it was a kind of chaos, maybe a small group of extremists. So Russia Today's propaganda has nothing to do with logics. They usually use several controversial statements, and they all go together for different public, for different audience. The second one, no agency not only for Maidanian events, but for Ukraine in general as a country. Because it's not about Ukraine. Ukraine is just a battlefield, a trophy, so there is a great struggle between the Western world versus Eurasian world, or to be more precise, the USA versus Russia. So it's not about Ukraine, and she is just an object here, but not a subject by no means. And the third, oh my God, I have some problems with speaking. Sorry. And the third point is that there is not only Ukraine has nothing to do, it's not a subject, it's not an actor within this context, but it's not an entity actually. So it's a kind of very vague residue of the Soviet Union, which happened to get this sovereignty, this becoming a state without really being a state. And this issue of lack of integrity, lack of entity for Ukraine is very actively used in different discourses, that we have several parts of Ukraine which have, each of them has very different history, and they are not actually united, and they do not want to be together, and so we lack this feeling of entity. And here usually appeal to the history or to the Russian language, as we know, which was a hot issue, especially during Crimea operation. What else is used by propaganda? I believe it was Zbigniew Brzezinski who created this notion of whataboutism. If I'm mistaken, please correct me. It means that we are not the first. We did not do it first. What about you? Oh, you, America. Didn't you? What did you do in Iraq? What did you do in Yugoslavia? So, well, no, you shouldn't say that we are bad. So it's always without not answering, but without kind of making this gesture. It's not just about us, you are not, so let's talk about something else. And it is very good supplemented with some kind of mirror strategy. It was, to give you an example, it was very good, very effectively used during the Orange Revolution, when Yanukovych got like 45% and Yushchenko got 55%, and they created their poll and just changed it, just mirror the results, to prove that they have their alternative result. And Russia does it all the time. So they make something, and then they claim that the USA does this. And when Ukrainians try to talk to their Russian relatives and friends and say, come on, you do this and that, oh, we know. I saw it on TV, we know that the USA did it, and that's why you're brainwashed. So it's a very good antidote for revealing the truth, and it's working. And I mentioned already this schizophrenia and propaganda, that you use some controversial narratives. There are no Ukrainians, there is no Ukrainian nation, but at the same time Ukrainians are intolerant and blah, blah, blah. So it kind of very different and badly fitting together narratives. What I have to analytically here stress here is use diverse rhetoric for different audiences, because they target their audience very well. By they, and now I'm in Russia today, again as a media apparatus of Russian regime. So there is some kind of universal claim. It is a fascist threat, so it's a kind of, it's something that should scare like everyone in the world, because fascism is bad, we know it for sure since childhood. And so it works for Europeans, for Americans, for Russians, and for some Ukrainians as well. And besides this vision, this understanding of Maidan as a chaotic revolt, so it's kind of, it's uncontrolled, it's uncivilized. So if you want to live in a civilized world, you should be against such events, because it's bad, because it breaks into the natural course of events. Going further, for the Western audience, it was about this liberal rhetoric, about protecting the rights of Russian-speaking people, the freedom to choose, for Donbass people to be sovereign if they want to. So it's kind of the smoke screen of liberal ideas and ideals. For the European public, it's a kind of anti-American and anti-capitalistic rhetoric, that it's all about money, and guys, maybe you are not so sure about your colleagues with America, and they are trying to shake the world, something like that. For Russian people, this resentment of the great Russia rising up the east, dealing with the idea of Putin that the worst tragedy of the 20th century was the disappearance of Soviet Union. So, and now we are strong enough to get it back together. So we can revenge, and we can show the Americans what we can do. And suddenly for Ukrainians, I would say it is mainly the framework, was it worth it? Come on, now you see, was it worth it? I live in Ukraine, that's why I want to focus for this framework, because right now it seems to be, again, very effective. So it's usually about posing, like, you know how ideology and propaganda works now. You do not suggest answers. You are just framing the agenda. And by doing so, you kind of provoke the certain course of thinking about what's going on. So kind of tricky question here, is Poroshenko, Yatsenyuk, new authorities better? Was it really worth it? Just imagine, you had Crimea, peace, and the kind of economic stability. And right now you have none of that, so was it worth it? Don't get me wrong, I'm getting all this not to persuade you into these views, even it may seem so. But propaganda usually disappears if you are aware of it, and the main logic of its how it works is pretending, giving some point of view as natural, as objective view, as a natural course of events, which you shouldn't question, because this is how things are. And by revealing that these are cliches and some frames from propaganda, I'm suggesting you to rethink and to rearrange maybe. Of course, I'm making many statements, and it should be argued better, but if you have some questions, I would be happy to answer them. So what I give you as an alternative framework of thinking about Maidan. I think Alina told a lot about it, but I would stress that Maidan, for post-Soviet Ukraine, definitely it was precedental in terms of popular consensus. Because it happened so that since 1991, Ukraine actually was split by many criteria, and this was a precedental case of unity, at least for the most part of the country. So it was not the direct democracy, but this was kind of bottom-up democracy. And here I'm using, it was value-based, and I think that I like the notion of Etienne Balibar of liberty as the freedom of citizenship to contest the social contract. So it was really questioning existing order, which was not satisfactory for a vast majority of Ukrainian people, And they used their right, although kind of violent, but still to establish a new law and to have a hope for establishing a new country. By saying that that was a constructive event, of course, we all see these frightening pictures from Grushevskoy Street, that it didn't look constructive at all, but nevertheless, I make a special accent on that because by many reasons. First of all, from the very beginning, Maidan was absolutely non-violent, and there were a system of taboo. It was a system of taboo that you couldn't, it was kind of obsession with order because if to involve the famous theory of Friedrich Nietzsche of two origins in every culture, Dionysian and Apollonical. So on one hand, we had this strive for order, and on the other, this chaotic. And on Maidan, it was a taboo for alcohol. So it wasn't allowed to drink alcohol at all. And to my mind, although it seems to be kind of strange detail, but at the same time, by the same token, it seems kind of a natural idea to warm yourself up when it's minus 20 Celsius degree. But it was this, rejection of Dionysian origins. So we want order, and it was structured. Many people, many units. And it was a kind of parallel society, because it was not just chaotic mob. No, we had a system of healthcare, army, even education. It was an open university of Maidan, so it was a double society. We do not like society the way it is now, so we want to build and to show this utopia. Of course, it cannot function for a long time, but still it is an example of what we want to live, what we want to see. So, about this legacy of Euromaidan, I think I mentioned a bunch of these features, which seems to be important, but the most important one is that it was not about politics. It was not about political leaders or authorities. It was about people. And it created this new feeling of the power of people, but power not as kind of using power to impose it on someone, but to make a difference, to make a change. And now we have this society of volunteers. A year ago we didn't have an army at all, and right now people are supporting army and getting, I don't know, all what is needed. And of course this idea of Europe is worth investigation because it was called Euromaidan, and to me it's a very big question how it correlates to European values or to real existing European countries, or was it just kind of imaginary Europe, kind of empty meaning, which people just fool with some features they want to see in their life. So to wrap up, what Ukraine lacks and needs. No simple answers, but well, I'm simplifying a lot. What we need externally? Of course we need resources. Everyone is accustomed that Ukraine is asking for something. But as I mentioned, I started with it that now we have hybrid war. That's why we need weapon for both dimensions. And these are media support, and weapon. And internally, of course, right now we are lacking. That's why, I mentioned that Putin was successful in overcoming consequences, not only in framing Maidan itself, but in overcoming consequences. But right now we have a rise of hatred, the lack of unity, the lack of consistency in this corruption issue, which was highlighted best. Well, but my statement here is a Ukrainian citizen that it was worth it, because otherwise it would have been much worse. Thank you for your attention.
All right, and the next speaker is Taras Kuzio, who will speak about, who will give us probably a more of a bird's eye view on developments in Ukraine. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to talk more about the conflict and the security aspects. Probably something will come up about the international ramifications and, of course, what was agreed this week, my views on that. Just to sort of bring in what previous speakers have spoken about, I think it's a very common American trait, maybe more than in other countries, to assume that everybody in the world wants to live in a democracy. Maybe that was the fallacy of the Arab Spring in some ways and the invasion of Iraq. But it's not the case. It's not the case in the former USSR as well. Surveys in Ukraine, and this directly relates to this topic, surveys in Ukraine show that about 30% of Ukrainians preferred economic growth, and stability over political democracy. And these are the typical voters who voted for the party Regent and the Communist Party, and they're the voters who vote for Alexander Lukashenko and for Vladimir Putin. So there are many voters in that part of the world who actually are not interested in the democracy that we think. So when we're talking about the Euromaidan, we should remember that there was this hardcore constituency. It was very dominant in places like the Donbass, two oblasts of Donetsk, Luhansk, and Crimea in particular, because Donbass is as unique in eastern Ukraine as Galicia is unique in western Ukraine. Concepts such as East Ukraine or West Ukraine kind of don't really give us the right picture when we talk about that. They're different. I guess like California is different to the whole western part of America. In the Donbass you had a very strong, and the Crimea, a very strong Soviet identity. Soviet identity was, and I'm talking now, not 20 years ago, Soviet identity was still stronger in the Donbass and Crimea, i.e. more people adhere to it than Russian or Ukrainian. And those were the only two regions of Ukraine which had a stronger Soviet than, say, Russian or Ukrainian identity. And this preference for the buzzword for authoritarian leaders in Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, and the former USSR is the word stability. And for them, Orange Revolution, Rose Revolution, Euromaidan are the antithesis of stability. And therefore, there's something to oppose. And Yanukovych talked about stability all the time. His two parliamentary coalitions included the word stability in the term. And although, of course, a huge number of people supported the Orange Revolution and the Euromaidan, we're talking about 1 in 5 Ukrainians in both cases. At the same time, there was a hardcore opposition. Opinion polls showed that in the Donbass, the majority of people believed this was an American-inspired coup d'etat, putsch, that brought fascists to power. This is what they were receiving from Russian TV, which is what the majority get their news from. And this also had fertile ground. Now, it didn't have fertile ground throughout the Russian-speaking regions of eastern and southern Ukraine. And this is where Putin didn't get his homework very well. And I would disagree slightly with the previous speaker that Putin knows something about democracy. I don't think he does. But anyway, that's a separate question. We can leave that for drinks later. Ukraine has basically 8 Russian-speaking oblasts or regions in eastern and southern Ukraine. Putin's so-called New Russia. Now, this is obviously an artificial and abstract concept. He first raised it in April 2008 at the NATO summit in Bucharest, where he began to talk about Ukraine as an artificial state. So this is not something new. It's been bubbling away for a long period of time. His conspiracy mindset began to go into overdrive in 2011, 2012 when you had mass protests on the streets of Moscow. He, like Yanukovych, believes these kind of protests in Moscow or Kiev are funded by the CIA, they're Western funded. And so he came to power, back to power in 2012. He needed his new values. His new values were going to be conservative values, and this Ruski Mir, Russian world. And by this Russian world, what he means by that is that Belarusians, Ukrainians, and Russians are part of one and the same Russian people. So going back to basically the Tsarist view that there isn't a Ukrainian or Belarusian people. He also can't get his head around, like many people in Moscow, the very concept of a Russian-speaking Ukrainian patriarch. He's obviously never traveled to Scotland or Ireland or Wales, and he doesn't know Canada, he doesn't know Austria, because these countries have the same language as their neighbors, yet they have distinct national identities. But for Putin, there are 17 million Russians in Ukraine. What he's talking about is 17 million Russian speakers. And he assumed that these Russians or Russian speakers would create an uprising and demand the coming into Ukraine of Russian liberators, because Russians are always liberators, of course, never invaders, and to protect the Russian speakers from the fascists who have come to power with CIA help in Kiev. But it didn't work, because they just don't understand Ukraine. Russians don't. They didn't understand Ukraine, the Orange Revolution, and they didn't understand it the last year or so. And in 6 of the oblasts, I can't really see it from here very well, but in 6 of the oblasts, if you look at the bottom there, in 6 of the oblasts, it didn't work, the Russian-speaking oblasts. In 4 of them, there's no pro-Russian feelings at all. Dnipropetrovsk, which was a very important city in the Soviet Union, the home for the so-called Dnipropetrovsk mafia, Brezhnev and co. And the city with the biggest factories producing nuclear weapons in the world, so a very important center. Zaporizhia, Cossack area, and then southern Ukraine, Kherson and Mykolaiv. There was no support for Putin at all there. There was some in the swing regions of Odessa and Kharkiv, and this is where you had a lot of bloody fights on the streets of those 2 cities in March, April, and May. By early May, Ukrainian forces had mobilized, Russian-speaking Ukrainian forces had mobilized in those 2 cities, and they received the upper hand. So the only place that he was successful was really in the 2 oblasts of Donbass. But even there, and even how bad the Ukrainian security forces were, they were still being defeated by July, August, and Putin at that stage had to decide either to give up on the separatists in the Donbass or to invade, and he decided to invade. And it's been downhill really ever since then, because the Minsk I agreement in September didn't lead to anything. Any peace just led to even more Russian troops and volunteers, extremist volunteers, by the way. We're talking about the most extreme sections of Russian society. We have the funniest paradox, something out of George Orwell, where we have Russian Nazis coming to Donbass to protect Russian speakers from Ukrainian fascists. I mean, George Orwell couldn't have written this better. And these are real Nazis. These are guys from like the Russian Party of National Unity who do this at their party congresses. Go on the internet and look them up. They have a Nazi symbol as their party symbol. The BBC in December, it's on YouTube, you can find it, did a great documentary about pro-Tsarist, I'm not kidding you, pro-Tsarist volunteers coming from Petersburg to fight in Donbass. They want to restore the Tsar to Russia. It's called Russia's Imperialist Warriors. Look it up, BBC documentary. So these crazes are being permitted by Putin to come in. You know, the FSB is just going, yeah, we don't see anything. Plus, of course, Russian intelligence, Russian forces. But the New Russia project failed. It required Russian forces to support the Donbass separatists. They've gone to Plan B, and the Plan B is now there are terrorist attacks throughout Ukraine taking place on a regular basis, particularly in Odessa, Kharkiv, against military recruitment centers, against pro-Euromaidan civil society volunteer organizations, train lines, and such like, throughout the country, but particularly in sort of places in eastern and southern Ukraine, behind line. These are people trained either in Crimea or trained in Rostov-on-Don. And one of the groups that mobilized in Kharkiv were football fans. Now, I'm from Britain. Football fans are usually pretty unpleasant people. They usually love to just fight for the hell of fighting. Not usually seen as positive, in a positive image. But here they were. They created this great chant called Putin Huilo. Putin is a dickhead. Which again you can find on YouTube. And believe you me, in Kiev now you can find this everywhere. You can find Putin Huilo toilet paper. T-shirts, scarves, you name it. And people of all generations hold this now. It's not something just done by football fans. So it's obviously a way, humor is a good way to deal with crises, and this is one way. But anyway, so Putin's hybrid war, I kind of call it as a kind of international corporate raiding. They do corporate raiding on a domestic level. This is a mafioso regime. Look at Karen DeWish's book, just came out, traces Putin's links to crime since the late 80s, early 90s. A university professor from Miami in Ohio. And the US WikiLeaks cables already talked about Russia as a mafia state in 2010. And the British intelligence documents have come out in the trial, well not the trial, but the investigation into the assassination of Litvinenko, the exile from Russia in London in 2006, also talk about Russia as a nuclear mafia state, as a mafia state committing nuclear terrorism on the streets of London. So this is a country where corporate raiding is the norm. I mean, all of the Ukrainian state and private enterprises in the Crimea have been illegally taken over by Russia. There's been no compensation paid to Ukraine for that, for all the businesses, private and state enterprises, banks in the Crimea. But sadly, we also in the West have double standards. It didn't take the Crimea to wake up the West about Russia's intentions. The annexation of the Crimea, which was the first land grab in Europe since World War II. It took the shooting down of the Malaysian airline with 300 civilians, including 80 children. Where we saw, and I think this was the shock on Chancellor Merkel's personality, the shock of Putin not giving a damn about these deaths. This guy's a sociopath. I mean, he's got a long record of that, going back to the late 90s when his organization, the Russian equivalent of the FBI, FSB, undertook terrorist attacks within Russia against their own civilians and blamed it on the Chechens. So that, and then of course the month after this shooting down of the airliner was the Russian invasion, and then the sanctions talk, and now more lately the talk about sending arms to Ukraine began to appear. The number of deaths, I mean, the way this is now described as the worst crisis in Europe is because of the huge numbers. I think all sides are underestimating or undercounting the number of deaths. The Ukrainian official figure is 5,600 civilians. That was a few days ago, so it's probably already 6,000 now, 6,000, but the German intelligence figure is 50,000 civilians. And then I think both sides understate the casualties on the military side. By the way, the Russian military casualties, not separatist, Russian military casualties are at a worse rate in terms of the numbers and time period than those in Afghanistan in the 80s. Why I'm not optimistic about the Minsk II agreement, and they're fighting away as we speak, is that Russia has, or Putin has demands within the realm of the fantasy world, and any leader in any country, never mind President Poroshenko, if they were to accept these demands, would be basically going, I surrender. I capitulate. That's all Putin's demanding. He's seeking to destroy Ukraine as an independent state. There's no other way to describe it. Look at the demands. He wants to annul 2 elections held last year, which were democratic, recognized as democratic by the OSCE Council of Europe, install a puppet leader, a pro-Russian leader. He doesn't call it puppet leader, he calls a pro-Russian leader. Ukrainian Kadyrov will be superb. Or Ukrainian Ivanishvili, the pro-Russian leader of Georgia. So, I mean, how do you realistically go about that? How do you say we annul 2 elections held last year and install pro-Russian government, parliament, and leader? How do you transform Ukraine into a federal state where one region of that federal state has a veto over your foreign policy? There isn't a federal state in the world where that exists. No, I mean, Quebec would maybe love, I live in Canada, Quebec might love to control Canadian foreign policy, whatever there is of it, but but it's never going to do that. And that's also ridiculous. Ukraine, it wants the Ukrainian parliament to overturn its move away from non-bloc status, but again, that was voted in December by a vote of 302. That's a constitutional majority. How do you tell those 302 deputies, sorry guys, you're going to have to take your votes back. We're going back to non-bloc status. Again, how do you do that? You're not going to believe it, the last point, he really does, and this has come out in various places, including former Polish Foreign Minister Radek Sikorski. The Russians really do want to sit down with the West and divide up Europe into spheres of influence, where Ukraine is on this side. Because the very concept of Putin's Russian nationalism is that Ukraine cannot be in the West. It has to be within this Ruski Mir area. So that's why I'm not very optimistic about Minsk 1 was a failure. I mean, nothing was implemented by Russia or the separatists. I'm not very optimistic, sadly, about Minsk 2. And if that collapses or fails, then President Obama is going to he's not going to be able to stop the floodgates of the demands from both parties and both houses of Congress for the supply of defensive military equipment to Ukraine. And the Europeans in turn are not going to be able to stop, they're not going to be able to say no longer no about going down the path of Iranian-style sanctions, of very tough economic financial sanctions, including removing Russia from SWIFT. I think that's where we're heading. Just going back to what I talked about Russian forces in Ukraine, sometimes they hide who they are, sometimes they don't. This picture at the bottom is Russian Marines fighting in Donetsk airport. It was from Russian TV. Somebody forgot to tell them to take their lapels off. This just shows you some of the casualties that Russian NGOs, by the way, are collecting. And if journalists try to report and cover the secret burial at night of Russian soldiers, they're usually beaten up by thugs. This is a return to the 1980s when also bodies coming back from Afghanistan were buried at night secretly. This is what I was telling you about. Aren't the Russian speakers of Donbass lucky when they have these guys to come and protect them? These are the real McCoys, real fascists. This is the Russian Party of National Unity I talked about. On the right, they're fighters in Donbass. On the left, these are the Nazis who have come down to Odessa to help the Odessa fight the fascists in Odessa. But Putin even has a more Orwellian alliance with the far right of Europe. His conservative values, so-called, means that his conservative values and his Islamophobia, don't get mistaken by him hanging around without his shirt on all the time, his Islamophobia and homophobia give him direct sort of alliances with the far right of Europe. And so you have these fascists and neo-Nazis and populist nationalists coming to the Crimea and Donbass to take part in these fake elections and referendum to give them some kind of legitimacy. Le Pen in France is the most popular fascist party in Europe, and she just received a nice loan, in inverted commas, from Putin. I'm sure he won't ask for that loan back. But we also in the West were in some degree guilty. You know, I mean, there is a reason why Putin looks upon us, particularly Europeans, less than Americans, because he's more afraid of America and NATO than Europe, as a bunch of cynics. The Europeans keep telling Putin about European values, and then at the same time, Europeans keep taking dirty Russian and Ukrainian money. I mean, that's why London is nicknamed Londongrad, or Moscow on the Thames. Cyprus, there's a reason why Cyprus is the biggest foreign investor in Ukraine. Because it's one big washing machine for dirty Russian and Ukrainian money. Yet it's a member of the EU. America has tougher due diligence laws, so that dirty money doesn't come here. But Europe doesn't. And the biggest export of Russia wasn't energy, it was corruption. And it was successful in buying up many people, politicians, and political consultants and such like. After all, it also bought an ex-German chancellor to run a Gazprom project to Germany from Russia. But the West also ignored previous frozen conflicts. You know, what's the big deal about this Ukrainian frozen conflict? I mean, there have been frozen conflicts around since 1992, which the West has ignored. And when Saakashvili tried to take back Georgian territory, by the way, South Ossetia is part of Georgia legally, it was Western Europe was more critical of Saakashvili than of Russia, which invaded. So the West has never had a policy on these frozen conflicts, never tried to resolve them or get Russia to try and resolve them. Just finally, I mean, the big love between Germany and Russia is over, and a lot of the investment that Russia did in Western Europe, particularly in sort of, I think, the more Russophile countries of Italy, France, and Germany, have been turned around. We do have a major crisis. NATO today does argue that Russia's actions towards its neighbors are on a par with international terrorism. The United States and some NATO countries are sending high-tech military equipment and forward rapid defense forces to the Baltic states and elsewhere. Some people don't want to call it a new Cold War because they don't see an ideology, a conflict of ideologies. Others would say more so. But if you look at or read the images of how Russia is portrayed today, this is on a level from decades ago. And if we get, if Minsk II fails and then we move to Europe taking on Iranian-style sanctions, economic and financial, and the United States followed by maybe Canada, Britain, Poland, and the Baltic states supplying defensive military equipment, then this begins to look very much like the 1980s. Thank you.
All right, thanks very much. Now we're open to questions. Raise your hand and say your question. Keep it brief, please.
Well, I heard a lot of things I disagree with, but I'll just ask you a quick questions. If I ask some comments on the assault. Can you speak up? Can you hear me? If you could please comment on the Nazi symbolism and the general attitudes in the assault and similar National Guard.
Don't repeat the question.
And question number two is, what exactly are the defensive military weapons that you hope Ukraine will get from the United States? What, other than bulletproof vests and such? There's talk of actual lethal weapons, so could you give some examples of defensive lethal weapons?
Well, I don't work for the Ukrainian government, so I'm not asking for this.
Right, well, you seem to have a position.
I would prefer a diplomatic resolution, but I don't believe that one exists. So the options are either to allow Putin to Bosnianize and, I don't know, wherever, carry on his carnage in Ukraine. You do nothing about it, basically, or you do something about it. The West hasn't rushed to the decision to send this. Obama's been very much against it all along. And even Canada's been against it. But Putin is not giving them any other options. If Putin and the separatists had implemented Minsk I, there wouldn't have been a need for Minsk II. If Minsk II is implemented, there'd be no need for tougher economic financial sanctions or defensive military equipment. But they're not implementing them, and I don't think they will. Maybe I'll be wrong about Minsk II, but I don't believe that that's going to happen. If Minsk II isn't implemented, therefore you have the options of allowing the Russia to do what it wants, hoping that it doesn't move on to other countries after that, like the Baltic states, which have very large Russian-speaking minorities. In the case of Latvia, even bigger than Ukraine, by the way. Or you try to do something about it. The dangers are there on all sides, because a disintegrated, Bosnianized Ukraine with an economic and financial crisis is not something that many Europeans living in that part of the world want either. The kind of equipment we're talking about is not bulletproof vests, that's already been sent. That's called non-lethal. Night vision, military meals, bulletproof vests. We're talking, I think today, about three things. We're talking about satellite intelligence to the Ukrainians about what's going on the other side of the front line, which I think is crucial. We're talking about, I think the most important thing probably, training and advice. And then also some types of technical hardware, which I'm not a specialist in, such as handheld anti-tank weaponry. Why do I think training and advice is crucial? Because what we have is both sides, particularly the Russian and separatist side, using, in effect, World War II tactics, which are destructive for buildings and property, but also kill huge numbers of civilians. Russia already did this in Chechnya. It obliterated Grozny. America's not done that anywhere in the world. It hasn't obliterated a city from the face of the map. It didn't obliterate Baghdad, sorry. And this is what they're doing. They're just lobbing artillery and Grad rocket missiles. That's their tactics. 70% of Ukrainian casualties, military casualties, are from rockets and Grad.
Coming from where?
Coming from the Russian side, separatist side. Now, if the training and advice will at least be able to create forces which are the kind of forces that Americans, Canadians, Britain and others have been using in, say, Afghanistan, Iraq and elsewhere, which I would call, say, special forces or counterinsurgency forces, which rely more on that and have some kind of accountability and are not in the realm of just not giving a damn about civilian casualties, as opposed to reliance on artillery and rockets. On the question of the Azov battalion, I'm just interested, by the way, to ask you a question. Do you ever raise the question of Russian Nazis in Ukraine, or just Ukrainians?
I'm very concerned with both.
Are you? Gee, I didn't hear a question about the Russians.
Well, you made enough points about the Russian aggression and...
No, I'm not talking about Russian, I'm talking about Russian Nazis.
I am quite appalled by Nazis on both sides.
Because it always seems to come up just something about the Ukrainians, Nazis.
Well, you seem to have overlooked that very important aspect in your
I haven't overlooked it. I think they're idiots for having that type of flag, complete idiots. They do, though, they are a unit within the Ministry of Interior, they're not a rogue unit. They have some foreign volunteers in their ranks from populist, rationalist parties in the West. I know one particular Swedish guy that's a member of that battalion. But if you're looking at comparisons, the biggest number of volunteers from Europe have gone to the separatist side. There's 100 Serbs fighting on the separatist side. French and other fascists are fighting with the separatists. One has to also take into account what kind of regimes are in both places. Ukraine's a corrupt democracy, a corrupt young democracy. Russia's a neo-fascist state.
I'm sorry, we have lots of questions.
So, I mean, that's the difference.
May I chime in just to say, I forgot to mention, that this report actually outlines some of the specific weapons that should be supplied as defensive lethal weapons. This was put out very recently, if you haven't seen it, by the Atlantic Council, Brookings, and the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and I brought in the copies for everyone if you're interested. Please pick it up.
Thank you.
Is
Question?
it free copies?
Yes, that's free.
So there's no doubt that more weapons would bring the war on a higher scale, and if it would help Ukraine to succeed, it is great. But one cannot exclude the opposite scenario. And would anyone think about alternatives, like after the Second World War, when Austria was in hands of Soviet Union or Finland, and could such direction still be kind of a direction to move, or what?
I mean, that particular kind of idea, or Finlandized or Austrianized, is something that has been raised, but we're talking about a different era for one time. You know, Austria was occupied by the Soviet Union, and the Austrians readily agreed to it in some ways. I mean, they were occupied, and they didn't aspire to join NATO at the time. So it's a different era, I would say. And also, the Soviet occupying force didn't install a puppet regime or an authoritarian regime. Austria was a democracy, as well as being, and so was Finland. These were countries that didn't join NATO. They understood Soviet neighboring power, but they were permitted to sort of, have a market economy, have free elections, and such like. And that's something that Russia isn't really providing for the case of Ukraine. Russia would like a kind of a mishmash between Austria and Chechnya, a kind of thing, a kind of Austrianized Kadyrov maybe or something. So I think that is really, but how do you, I mean, the irony is that Putin's making these demands at the same time as he and Yanukovych have destroyed the pro-Russian camp and have actually made Ukrainians more pro-European. So, and he's now saying we should pull back from that.
Alina, Valeria, do you have something to tell in on this?
The potential alternatives was the question?
I think this is what
Well,
we've been
alternative
observing
to
for the whole
forceful
time.
approaches. So, and it's not only in terms of the war, also for the society, because there are different views, and I have not been in Ukraine for almost 15 years, but I have many colleagues and I have relatives in Donetsk and even from Kiev and Kyiv, so I'm getting limited information. And I know that society is very radicalized, and there are people who are afraid, and it would apply to all parts of Ukraine, that there is no freedom of speech, and people are really very much scared to talk about, particularly if their thoughts are not directly in line with who is controlling the territory. So there is not much, from my opinion, done to try to ease conflicts and ease different opinions. So there is more given the forceful and to push, and people are talking about killing and all. The kill is too little. This is what I hear from all people from different sides, and this is very pitiful.
All right, another question.
Is there any explanation why estimation of number of killed non-combatants by German intelligence and by Poroshenko are so different 9 times?
I don't work for German intelligence, so I don't know. But this was a German intelligence document leaked to a German, these documents never leaked, they're given to a German newspaper, and their calculation was 50,000. The UN calculation, which is what Poroshenko says, is about 5,600. I think that's way under. If I was going to make a guess, I would say the true figure is between the two. Somewhere between the two. Because many people die and they're not buried, or they're in destroyed buildings, and such like. I mean, it's very sad.
The question.
Yes, please.
Please, sorry, if you have a microphone, you're speaking.
In all histories of wars, the requirements to win the war is mobilizations for the war, mobilization of the whole society. And there is no example in history that war and deep reforming of the society, of the economy, of the political structure would conduct at the same time. So Ukraine has to do both tasks simultaneously. How can the society handle that?
As we see, it's kind of hard because we have a hybrid war on one piece of Ukrainian territory and a kind of hybrid piece on another one. And a big part of Ukrainian society feels that the authorities use the warfare as an excuse not to make reforms. And they feel this loyalty and tolerance because we understand that changing the authorities right now can make, can be a very big challenge for Ukrainian state as such. So, well, this is an issue. So there are no simple answers because right now it's not successful, and suddenly, unfortunately, we do not have actual reforms.
Ukraine cannot go from an anti-terrorist operation, as it's now called, to what you're saying, full-scale mobilization and declaration of war. Because if it did, then it would no longer receive Western assistance. IMF and organizations like this do not lend to countries at war. So Ukraine's relying on Western assistance. Wouldn't get it if it was officially at war.
So just to follow up a little bit on that, actually I'm very interested in the comments you made around the horizontal volunteer networks that sprung up during Maidan. I'm wondering how permanent do you see that sort of upswell, and given that, what do you think, like if you were to take a sort of stock of what the current assets of Ukraine are in terms of hard assets, in terms of friends or support, what do you see as what would success look like a year from now in terms of the civil society in practical terms, and how might we get to that point?
I would answer that way, that right now, unfortunately, civil society and state apparatus or political elites are kind of detached one from another, and the crucial issue here is the accountability. Because right now we do not have this feedback. It looks like there are two absolutely separate dimensions, because civil society is concerned with war and is trying to do whatever it can do about it, and political elites are concerned with some other troubles, working with Western partners, making all these negotiations. And I think that if not a mark of success, but at least a good step towards it would be this accountability, because it's not about changing Yanukovych for Poroshenko. It was about changing the system itself, and the biggest change would be the accountability that anyone who can become a leader or a president must feel that he has to take into account the civil society.
I would also add to that an interesting development in the last parliamentary elections, right, was that it was the first time in Ukraine's history there was no communist party that entered parliament. And on the other hand, there was this group of people who did not have government experience before, these sort of people, journalists, for example, civil society activists. There's still a small group within the parliament, within the Rada, but they have the potential, because they're outsiders and because they were civil society activists, to be a sort of connector between government and civil society, but we'll see if that actually happens.
Taras, do you have something to say?
I'm okay, and there's lots of questions.
Okay, Mozov Norway.
Yeah, I'm actually from Ukraine. Thank you so much for all your presentations. So my question is, do Ukraine actually need this narrow strip of land on the east? What's your personal opinion of that? And do you have any information? What's the opinion in Ukraine? Do we actually need that land? Maybe we should just give it away and be so. Maybe it's not a good solution in terms of geopolitics. I don't know. What's your opinion?
I think it's a very good question. Very good question. And one interesting response to this will be to see which parts of Ukraine which parts of Ukraine have lower turnouts for people called up for conscription. Because lower turnouts mean they don't really want to fight for this land, right? And guess where the lowest is? West Ukraine. West Ukraine.
Okay.
West Ukraine has the lowest turnout, people turning up who were called to the conscription office. Because West Ukraine's a long way from Donbass. The highest, 100%, is East Ukraine, Eastern and Southern Ukraine. Because they think, shit, if Donbass goes, then Dnipropetrovsk's next, Kharkiv's next. They have 100%. They're right on the doorstep of the conflict. It's 700, or I don't know, 800 miles from Donetsk to Lviv. It's a long way. It's another world. and the lowest turnouts are there. I think you have a point, and you have a point for a number of reasons. Firstly, even if Putin says, I give up, okay, I'm out of here, I'm going to just spend my 40 billion somewhere, right? That I've accumulated over 12 years. And Ukraine takes over this region of Donbass. It has to spend trillions of dollars to rebuild it. Where's it going to get this money from? And we also live in a corrupt part of the world. So, like with Sochi, some of it's going to get stolen anyway. But where's Ukraine going to find the money to rebuild it? Putin wants Ukraine to rebuild it. He doesn't want, we have the irony, the separatists want to join Russia. Putin's saying, no, stay put. And secondly, you've got to deal with the people there. And once there's been bloodshed in any conflict, it took Britain, the first democracy in the world, sorry, it wasn't America, it was Britain, 40 years to deal with Northern Ireland. And only 600 soldiers and police died over 30 years. This is much bigger than Northern Ireland. So it took the Brits 40 years to finally resolve it. How do you, convince these people who were living in the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republic that Ukrainians are not fascists, that they're not agents of the CIA, when some of them really believe it? So it's, all of these questions you're right to bring up. They're not being brought up, but I'd be surprised if there was a referendum in Ukraine. A lot of people would say, like you say, what's the point of all this? If they want their independence, they want to go to Russia, give them that opportunity. Because the Ukrainian forces could defeat the separatists, as we saw, but with Russia, they're never going to defeat them. With the Western arms, they can only make some kind of level playing field with Russia. Because Russia's only committing itself at the moment as a hybrid war, so low numbers of forces. With Western arms, with Ukrainian forces, could make that more equal. But Ukraine can never defeat Russia in this conflict. So you're absolutely right to bring it up as an issue.
So guys, I'll just put the microphone right here, and if you want to ask a question, you can form a line behind me. And my question is about the economy. Hopefully our moderator, Yuri Garadichenko, could weigh in on this as well. And that question